They were always smiling, always looking down at me. The photograph of 4 young soldiers from World War II and their parents hung in my grandmother's living room.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
During World War II, millions of men were drafted, though some would never return home. 3 of those young men were Jay, Tom, and Danny Baluh. And soon life in their small town of Larksville would never be the same. The Baluh boys called Larksville home, a small mining town in northeastern Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley. It consisted mostly of large families. The Baluh family was no exception. John and Mary Baluh, both Slovak, raised 8 children here, 7 boys and 1 girl. Mary was nearly 20 when she had her first son, Al. Next came Jay, Tom, Joe, Dorothy, then Danny, Fran, lastly Eddie. It was the time of big families and big dreams. Immigrant families like the Baluhs were working hard to make it here in the United States. But soon life would change. World War II began, and families were torn apart forever. Lives were lost, but not forgotten. However, no one would speak of these tragedies until years later. In 1998, Eddie's daughter Joni saw the film Saving Private Ryan, in which 3 brothers die in World War II. Joni always knew 3 of her own uncles had died in World War II, but not much else.
There's a scene in Saving Private Ryan where the military car pulls up to the house and the mother's washing dishes. And it cracks me up chokes me up to even think about it now. And she looks out and she sees this military car approaching the house. And there's no dialogue in the particular scene. And she comes out on her porch and collapses because she knows. And then you can see as she collapses further and further on the steps that they're telling her not 1, not 2, but 3.
But who were these men? What were they like? Well, most of us would say, why not ask your father, aunt, or uncles? Joni knew the answer to this simple question. The family did not talk about it, ever. It brought them back to a place they tried their whole lives to forget. Joni knew she had to do this on her own. At this point, she had only the names of her uncles and where they were buried to begin her search.
My father's the youngest of the family, and I realized that when he's gone and the rest of his siblings are gone, that no one will have known anything about these men. So I just started going about it quietly. All I knew was their names and where they were buried, and nothing more. I didn't have their dates of death. I remember getting out an old picture that I had of their graves and getting out a magnifying glass and trying to see if I can come up with something. I couldn't. I tried contacting the church where they were buried from, and they only had a broad from this date in September to that in November that they could have been buried. And I tried finding the funeral home, and I called the funeral home that had buried my grandmother. No, they weren't the right one. And even if they said, we don't know if we'd be the right one because all of our records were lost in the flood of 1972.
Joni needed the dates of their deaths and service numbers to request their death and burial records, neither of which she had. She was having trouble getting the information from the Military Records Center because she was a niece, not exactly next of kin. But soon her luck changed.
That's when I found Ken Schlesinger at the National Archives, and he found their names and their service numbers. And that let me go to the death and burial people and get their death and burial records. When the death and burial records first came, they were the first ones to show up. It talked about the condition of their bodies. And when my husband came home, I was sitting on the steps in our living room reading them and crying, and I really hadn't moved from the steps since the mail came. And that was rough. I did find, in order to get some newspaper copies without contacting the newspaper, I contacted the Historical Society in Wilkes-Barre, and they did a confidential search for me. And I contacted one of the libraries, and they did a search without anybody else knowing about it.
Joni learned more details about her uncle's funeral through the newspaper clippings and found herself overwhelmed.
When I got the newspaper copies and read about the funeral and how hard it had to be on my grandparents, I cried some more, and that's when my husband said, "I think you need to take a break."
The only project Joni worked on for the next couple of months was finding a book called The Cross of Lorraine, a combat history of the 79th Infantry Division. Unable to find an original copy, Joni's friend found a reprint on the internet. Listed among the dead were Uncles Jay and Danny. Joni began her search again, this time requesting her uncle's service records. It took some convincing, but one by one their records showed up, painting a much better picture of Jay, Tom, and Danny. Jay was a trained rifleman and ammunition bearer. He earned 2 Purple Hearts and the Combat Infantryman Badge. Jay was assigned to the 79th Infantry Division 3 days after it was reactivated in June 1942 at Camp Pickett, Virginia, and he remained with the unit until his death. The 79th left for England on April 7, 1944, spent a month there, and hit the beaches of France on June 14th. The unit saw its first combat 5 days later in the assault on Cherbourg. Jay suffered a severe head wound on September 16th and died at an evac hospital in France. He was 29 years old. Danny was also trained as a rifleman and scout. He earned a Purple Heart and the Combat Infantryman Badge. Danny arrived in England in mid-June 1944. He joined Company A of the 315th Infantry as a replacement in July. 4 days later, Danny was dead. He died on a day his unit was in a defensive position. Danny was only 19 years old. Tom's records tell a different story because he never saw combat. He was assigned to the 6th Infantry Division, 1st Field Artillery, Battery C, a week after he was inducted in 1942. Tom was sent to Hawaii in late September 1943. He was trained as a cannoneer, a member of a gun squad whose job it was to load, fire, and care for cannon. Tom became ill with a virus infection in Hawaii about a month after he arrived. When Tom received his yellow fever vaccination 4 days later, the two were a deadly combination. Tom became jaundiced and diagnosed with acute infectious hepatitis. He died on November 19th when his temperature topped 106 degrees. Tom was 26 years old. Joni had a stack of newspaper clippings and dry facts, but still no clue as to what her uncles were actually like. So she made the decision to tell her parents about her project.
I took my mother aside and I just said, "I've been doing something behind your back and I think it's time to tell you." And you know, she's gotten used to my little projects. And she says, "Now what have you done?" And so I told her what I'd been doing, and I'd been doing it at that point for about a year or so. And I said, "I'd really like to tell Dad." And she said, "How about I break it to him tonight when we go to bed, and then we'll talk in the morning." So I had gotten the yearbook from the unit that 2 of my uncles were in. And so she took that to bed with them. And they talked that night. And then the next day, he came down to breakfast and he just says, "I hear you've been busy." So I had pulled out some records, the ones that didn't have unpleasant details on it, to show him what I had gotten at that point. And at one point he just got up from the table and left. And I thought, what have I done? I didn't know if he was angry, upset, sad. You know, what have I done? I should have kept my mouth shut. And he went into the garage and came out with this big, battered box.
The box contained old photos, newspaper clippings, and even a simple wooden frame with a picture of a flag and 3 gold stars beneath it. During World War II, families displayed service flags to honor family members in the military, while gold stars signified war dead. Joni knew she had to write about these men, so over the next 18 months, she interviewed her family and World War II veterans. Joni's oldest Uncle Al, a retired sergeant first class with 3 rows of decorations, saw it fitting to write about the boys. Al helped Joni as much as he could with her story, but became ill and died shortly after. She now had to rely on her father, Aunt Dorothy, and Uncles Joe and Fran to fill in the gaps.